Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. I'm Justin. Do you share the blood of a Roman emperor? Is Charlemagne your grandfather? Is Isaac Newton your great-uncle? Could you even be distantly in line for a throne somewhere? If you've ever wondered about your family tree, you may have wondered who all might be in it. Maybe some famous historical figures. Well, the answer may be somewhat surprising. In this video, we will look at the genealogy and demographics mainly of Europe and Northern America and discuss who your ancestors may be and how you can tell. So, let's get to it. Before we begin, I would like to thank Tyler Teal, Guy Pithecus, Nikita Koba, Shaheen Gayasi, Martinas Mikalauskas, UCLA Jedi Knight, and Eric for being our most recent supporters on Patreon. They join these supporters who make these videos possible. The vast majority of us can work out, at least vaguely, who our ancestors were and where they came from based on our and our biological family's physical features like hair, skin, and eye color, and where we currently live. Unless your surname was changed, it can reveal even more, much more. If your last name sounds German, then your ancestors probably were German, or at least they came from that general area. When we research these names, however, and use our family history and genealogical records to go back and find the names and stories of our ancestors, many people find they are fortunate enough to go back much farther than they realized and find some very interesting things. How common is it to have such people as a famous scientist or crusader in your family tree? We'll come back to that. For the moment, though, let's consider this startling genealogical find. Almost every single president of the United States, with the exception of one or maybe two, is descended from King John of England, who lived from 1166 to 1216 AD. Which one is the exemption? Well, believe it or not, it's not Obama. Obama is actually half white. His mother had English heritage, so he's even in there. Side fact, most African Americans have some white ancestry, which links them to this discussion as well. The exception was Martin Van Buren being a Dutch name. It's unclear if the same was true for Donald Trump, but with his Scottish heritage, there's probably a relation as well. This was the discovery of a 12-year-old girl from California. An article about it was floating around a while back, and it was actually mentioned by someone in a live stream I did recently. This is at first kind of a spooky fact. It's not as incredible as it seems. As it turns out, nearly a third of all Americans, or 100 million people, may be the descendants of King John. Most presidents, with the exception of a handful, had direct recent English heritage, and obviously all except Van Buren had English ancestors somewhere in their family tree from at least the Middle Ages. So this find isn't so surprising. But how is it possible? Well, let's go back to medieval Europe. The first thing to consider here is that King John lived in the 1100s. He had 5 legitimate children and a handful of illegitimate ones. How many illegitimate children is unclear. King John is vilified in history, but he was definitely a bit of a party animal. From those 5 children, he had at least 22 grandchildren. Not all of them lived, but his illegitimate children had children as well, so he could have had 30 or so grandchildren. It becomes quite difficult to track after this outside the main line, but you could be looking at 100 or so great-grandkids, and so on and so forth. The math isn't completely simple. You have to account for the fact that many children would have died, some would have joined the clergy, or never reproduced, etc., etc. But as each generation multiplies over the course of 750 or so years, eventually you end up with literally over 100 million people being descended from King John of England when you factor in the descendants he has walking around the rest of the world. Say 300 years back to the late 800s to King Alfred the Great, who also had 5 children, and probably even more people alive today are descended from him. In fact, the vast majority of people of European descent are likely related to Alfred and his contemporaries. It helps to understand this if you start with yourself and go backwards. You have 2 immediate biological ancestors, your parents, and they each have 2 immediate ancestors as well, their parents bringing you to 4. Their parents bring it to 8, then 16, then 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and then you have 2048 great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great grandparents, 11 generations ago. Go back 25 generations, or somewhere in the ballpark of 750 years ago, as a generation is often defined as a 30-year period, and you have, mathematically, what initially appears to be over 33 million such great-grandparents, although this isn't entirely accurate. A few more generations and you'll have a billion ancestors listed in a time when there weren't a billion people around in Europe. The solution to this riddle is that you would see the same people appear in your family tree multiple times. Yes, that is kind of what it sounds like. It was quite common for third cousins, for example, to, often unknowingly, marry and have children. This isn't actually incest, because the distance between third cousins is far enough that the genes are fairly diluted. However, even first cousin marriage across the planet was not unheard of until only recently in the West, and it's still quite common in other areas of the world today. As people move around, they often spread their genes. Even though medieval Europe was quite isolated and marriage within those communities was, as I said, the norm, which partially explains all the first, second, and third cousin marriage, all it would take is one Frenchman descended from Charlemagne to move to Poland, and centuries later, millions of Poles are descended from Charlemagne as well. One such group, which tended to move around more than average, was the nobility. A quick glance through the history of Europe's monarchies shows Austrians marrying French kings, Germans marrying English queens, who are already from a German line to begin with, Germans on the throne of Russia, Frenchmen on the throne of Spain, and so on and so forth. Even as houses come to and fall from power, every European monarch around today is no doubt descended from Charlemagne in some way. Secondly, let's consider this. For most of European history, the upper classes, often the nobility, consistently outbred the lower classes, up until the Industrial Revolution, where the opposite has now become true. This was, of course, the case in the Middle East, India, East Asia, and societies like that as well. This means that, especially in periods of famine or diseases like the Black Death in the 14th century, the nobility had higher rates of survival and successful reproduction than the lower classes did. The wealthy typically had better access to food and water and lived outside cities and things like that, meaning recovery from disease and surviving famine was much more likely. You get the picture. There's a number of ways that this has been determined. One of which is the fact that noble last names have become more frequent over time. Names which were once held by, say, a royal Norman family in England, like Clare, Talbot, or any name beginning with Fitz, are now much more common in the English-speaking world. But one might think that, regardless of this, a social barrier was in place that prevented the nobility from intermingling with the lower classes, especially in the Middle Ages, so the lines must have remained diverged. There were indeed actually rules against marriage between people of different social classes at various points in history, but keep in mind, over generations, a great-grandson of a king, for example, might have a lower status of nobility. If he's the grandson of the king's youngest son out of 10 or 11 sons, then he might, at this point, be, in fact he would be lucky to be, lesser nobility, but really more like the middle class or some historical equivalent. Eventually, in fact quite quickly, diluted nobility married well-off individuals from the lower classes, and the genes spread. So, run this over the course of at least 1500 years or so, and gradually you come to see people descended from this nobility becoming more and more common, and the descendants of the older lower classes less and less common. Point being, yes, you are almost certainly related to at least some nobility of the area in which your ancestors lived, and the likelihood of this becomes greater the more distant the individual in question is. If you're descended from Europeans, then Charlemagne, who died in the early 9th century, is almost certainly your ancestor. Does this mean we're all connected to each other somehow? Yeah, in a way. If that fills you with warm and fuzzy feelings of love and kinship, well, that's great. But also keep in mind, genes and genealogy are different stories. Genetics is actually quite complicated, and because you only have a set number of indivisible genes, often genes from distant ancestors can be diluted and snuffed out. Now for the real question. How exactly can you determine the people from whom you're descended? Your last name is key, and knowing just your name and your mom's maiden name, as I said, can get you started going far. There are numerous sources and records online. If your family has been in the area for a while, you could even check places like your local library. To keep all your findings together, there are some online websites you could use. I mean, you could write it all on paper, but computers are infinitely easier to build family trees on. These websites are not paying me to recommend them or anything like that, it's just what I've come across in my time doing genealogical research. The site I first began using is called FamilyEcho.com. It's a simple but effective website that I've used for about 8 years now. Another website I found recently, which is interesting, is Geni.com. The goal of this website appears to be to build a massive family tree by allowing you to interact with others on the website and connect your tree to theirs when it detects a link between you. This allows you, when your family tree is built up enough, to link yourself to other figures and see your relation to people, both past and present, by using the information added by yourself and others to establish that link. I've played around a bit on the website, and I've actually found some links to Charlemagne and Louis IX, King of France. But keep in mind, it's important to verify the records before you get too excited, as anyone is able to add information on Geni.com. So it isn't necessarily perfectly reliable. And keep in mind, the process in itself is not exactly perfect either. Adoptions can often be dead ends in genealogical research. Furthermore, no offense to you or your family, or I suppose if we go back far enough, our family, but we probably all have a couple of great, etc. grandparents who had different fathers than what our family tree might say, if you understand what I mean. It may be impossible to determine exact accuracy, but in many cases, it's appreciably close enough. It may be disappointing that our medieval ancestors are less exclusive to us than we believed, unless we carry their last name or something like that. However, in another way, you could say that all of us of European descent carry the legacy of Augustus Caesar, Charlemagne, Alfred the Great, and others of this distant era, not only culturally, but genealogically as well. The same is true of the peoples of the Middle East, with figures such as the Prophet Muhammad, and the people of China, with Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty. I would add furthermore that someone who lived in the 19th century may have fewer descendants walking around today than Charlemagne, who lived over a millennium before. Charlemagne is the ancestor of most Europeans, but if you're directly related to Abraham Lincoln or Napoleon Bonaparte, that's much less common, and it would be much more personal. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning and subscribe to keep up with more like it in the future. To help with the cost of production, Fire of Learning does take donations on Patreon, the link to which you can find in the description. You can support the channel with as little as a $1 contribution. However, simply subscribing to our YouTube channel for free is also a large help. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters listed here. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so come check us out there too. Thank you for watching.